Okay, so this is Beatmaking 101 in Ableton Live, and this is the first time that we've officially used Ableton if you are new to the program in class. So I just want to go over a couple of things in this tutorial to make sure you understand how Ableton works. There's a whole bunch of documentation actually included in the actual written instructions, and I really want to encourage you to go through and read that. It talks all about how Ableton is similar and how it's different than Pro Tools that you've already done the Mixing 101 project in, as well as GarageBand that you've done Mixing 101 in. There's a lot of similarities there, that's for sure, but there are several things that are different about Ableton in terms of its design and even, frankly, what it's used for, and we'll be exploring all of that in considerable detail as we go through the class. But for right now, I just want to make sure that everything on the most basic of levels is making sense so that you can do this project. So the first thing you'll need to do is that once you are on the info page and you've called up the instructions, you're going to need to start Ableton. So in your dock, and again, like before, my dock looks a little bit different than yours in my studio, but we're looking for this live icon here at the bottom. It's in kind of a greenish color. It says Ableton Live Intro in this case. You're going to click on that, and you're going to get the following screen coming up in a moment. There we go. So it's loading up the program, and here we have what is referred to as a blank set in Ableton. Ableton refers to these things as sets. In Pro Tools, it's a session. In GarageBand, it's a project, but the concept here is just whatever we're working on. So there's a couple of things here that are going to look familiar to you. For example, towards the bottom here, particularly on the audio tracks, you can see it right now. When we add some instruments in a moment, you'll see the MIDI tracks make sense. But across the bottom here, we have a mixer, and we have a couple of things that'll look familiar to you. We have some panning knobs here for spatial placement. We have some faders here for level. And by the way, you can grab these things and you can move them just like you could in Pro Tools or GarageBand. Here's my fader. I can move that up and down and so on. We have a mute or engage button or an on button, depending on the way you want to phrase this in this case. But when it's lit up like that, this number 3, you will hear that track when you are playing material from it. If it's turned off, you won't hear anything. The S is a solo button. You can solo, and you'll notice that that's going to make only the soloed track able to be heard, just like in the other pieces of software. You also have a record enable button, just like this. So you have this mute button, you have the solo button, you have the ability to record enable and designate things just like you could do in other pieces of software that we've seen, panners, and you have faders. You also over here have audio effects, for example, things like compressors and equalizers, and actually a whole bunch of other things, and we will get to these. You don't need them for this project. In fact, you don't really need the mixer for this particular project, but I want you to be aware that it's there just so that you can start to compare Ableton with the other pieces of software that we've been doing. So in any case, things should be somewhat familiar. There's also forgive me, there's a couple other things you should know. Up here, there's a transport, and there's a bunch of other buttons up here we'll be getting to. You can change the tempo here where it says 120. This little button here, we're actually going to need it here in a minute. This will turn on or off my metronome, which in this case is off. I'll turn that on. It turns yellow when it's activated. And a whole bunch of other stuff here. But the basics, I'm hoping the concepts will start to make sense. So anyway, let's get started. So the very first thing that you want to do is make sure that you save the session properly in that external drive. So you would go up to File, and you would go to Save Live Set, and then you would follow those instructions regarding what it should be called. It should be the same kind of thing as what's in the instructions for the other assignments. Make sure you're saving in the external drive. Refer back to Mixing 101 in Pro Tools if you are having trouble doing that, or obviously you can see me in class for this and anything else. But what I really want to get to are the details of using Ableton for this project. Keep in mind also that Ableton has a really great extra feature in it, in that there is this little area down in the lower left corner called Info View, and pretty much everything that you place the mouse over, it's going to tell you what it is, how to access it, in many cases what to do with it, and lots of other great information. It's an incredibly handy feature and something that I know is going to help you as we're going through this project and several others. Okay, so The purpose of this project is to make a beat. So first things first, just like in all the other software, we need to make sure that the internal connections within the software are actually set up the way we want them to. In this case, we want to make sure we can actually hear things that we're going to create. So what we're going to do to make sure that that's correct is we're going to go up to Live, we're going to go down here to Preferences, and then there's this series of tabs here. If audio is not selected, make sure it is. Core audio is the driver type we need. Input device, don't worry about input device because we're really not going to be taking any microphones or anything like that or using an interface on this one. We're just going to be plugging in our headphones to the back of the computer like we did in the first two Mixing 101 projects. The audio output device is the area that we need to take a look at really quick. Now, in my case, once again, in my studio, I have a lot more options. My list is considerably longer depending on the configuration that I have going on at the time. But the one you need that I also have here is the one that says built-in output. That's the one you want to select. So make sure that your audio device is built-in output. Now for my studio, I've got to use the PreSonus FireWire Studio option, but for you, please make sure it says built-in output. If you don't have built-in output and you're plugged into the back of the computer, this won't work. So built-in output for you from here on out for this particular project, okay? All right, so I'm going to set mine back to where it needs to be, and then we can close out this window with this tab. All right, so how are we going to create a beat? Well, what we need to do is we need to establish an instrument first. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go over to this column here on the left and we're going to select Instruments. We're going to keep this really simple. I'm going to go to Impulse and there's a little arrow that's pointing to the right. I'm going to click that arrow so it's pointing down, and now I have a whole bunch of instruments I can choose from. These are all drum kits that I'm going to start with. I'm going to just take this very top one, Backbeat Room. I'm going to take this and I'm going to drop it right on top of my first MIDI track, and when I do that, can't put it over an audio track, by the way. This is a MIDI instrument, which means it's an internal virtual instrument. We're going to generate sound not from outside the computer, but from within the computer software. So it's got to go over this MIDI tracker. This will not work, and it won't even let me drop it over the audio track anyway. So in any case, MIDI track, and it populates at the bottom an instrument here. Now I can click on the little play buttons on each little sample here if I want, and I can hear the sounds and so on. But there's something else I can do in Ableton that's really pretty cool, and it's this. I'm going to make sure that in the upper right corner, this little yellow tab is lit up. If it's gray like that, it won't work. If it's yellow, it will. And now I can actually use the typing keyboard on my computer to trigger sounds. And you'll notice that this middle row here gives me sounds. Now, also be careful because the Z and the X key will change the octave, the range of that middle row. So if I press the Z key one time, I'm now down an entire octave, which means my A key for this instrument actually doesn't trigger anything. I have to go all the way up to the K before I get to the kick and the snare, so I'm more limited. So Z takes you down, X takes you up. You just want to make sure you're in the right range. So now I have the ability to actually trigger sounds. Now they're not velocity sensitive when I'm using this computer keyboard. It's basically just I get the sound or I don't. I can't change the volume depending on how hard I hit the key, but at least I can make some things work. And for this project, I need to perform something with this instrument using some kind of controller. Now, yes, you can also use a keyboard MIDI controller or a launch pad or a push unit or any number of others, but just to keep this simple, we're going to use just what we've got with the computer, and we're going to use the keyboard. And again, it's that middle row starting with the letter A and working our way up. So, what do we do next? Well, one of the things that you may have noticed is that our first MIDI track now, it's got a name, and suddenly we have the channel strip controls are now all filled out. So I've got my panning, I've got my levels, I've got my mute, I've got my solo, I've got my record enable. Record enabling a track is very, very important. You have to always tell the software, regardless of the program you're using, whichever DAW, digital audio workstation you're using, which track do you want to record to. So in this case, we're going to use this very first track. Now when it's record enabled, you'll notice that these buttons here are circles. These are actually record buttons for the individual, what are called clips. Ableton uses tracks very similarly to the way GarageBand and Pro Tools does, but it breaks those tracks down into clips, which are basically segments of musical information. And we'll get more into the details of what they are as we go through the program. But for now, just understand that each one of these little blocks can be its own separate piece of content, if you will, and you can choose which one ultimately you want to use. We're just going to create a single one here for now. However, if I turn this record enable button off, you'll notice that those upper buttons here, they change and they become stop buttons. So now, with it out record enabled, I can't record to these clip sections here at all. I have to record enable the track in order to do anything. Now, that being said, I don't want to click a record button just yet. I could, but it's going to add some variables that I don't want for this project. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to have Ableton give me a default area of space to record in, a single measure so that I have better control over what's going on. And the way I'm going to do that is I am simply going to place my mouse right in the space after the little circle. I'm going to double click there. And you'll see that I now have what's called a piano roll at the bottom. And I have, in fact, if this fold button is engaged, this little yellow fold button there, if I turn that on, I only get the sounds that are available to me through this drum kit. You'll also notice that I can see the beats. Here's beat 1, here's beat 2, here's beat 3, here's beat 4. You'll also notice that my track up here added a clip, and the circle button is now a triangle button, and it's actually a play button just like in the transport up here, and we're going to get to that play button here in a moment. But first, I want to confirm that I've got sound. I can do that a couple of ways. One way is I can actually click with my mouse on these little white squares. There's my kick, there's my snare, and so on. I can also, again, remember, use my computer keyboard, and I can trigger sounds that way. So now I need to actually make my beat. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that my metronome is on. I want a timekeeper, that click, so that I can keep track of where things are. I can adjust the tempo here if I want it to go faster or slower. In fact, let me play right here. Here you can hear the click. It's at 123. If I click on it and I just drag down, now it's really slow. I'll make it a little more reasonable here. That's at 65. You can hear it speeding up. You want to pick a tempo that you are comfortable working with, though. Fast can be fun and exciting, but if you can't control things, it isn't going to matter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just simply type in 120, which is where it defaults. Reasonably comfortable tempo, fairly easy to use. Okay, so I'm going to stop this for a moment. Now, what I'm going to do is, because of the way I have this set up, I'm not going to use the record button that's in the transport here, the arrangement record button. I'm going to use the session record button. And when I do that, it's going to allow me to start recording right here on this particular clip. So what I'm going to do is I am going to start recording some drum parts. I'm going to start with my kick drum. And what I'm going to try to do is get a kick that's just very simply on beat 1 and beat 3. So here we go. I'm going to give this a shot. Start recording. And you can see at the bottom here, you can see it's moving through and it just keeps cycling over and over. So here we go. Well, I've got 2 kick drum notes, that's for sure, but they are not lining up evenly with my click at all. So I have a couple of options. One option, and by the way, these notes here, they're blue, that means they're selected. If I click off, they're red, they're not selected. But if I select them, I got a couple things I can do. One is I could simply just delete them and try again, which is exactly what I'm going to do right now. We'll try it this way. We'll try it again, really hard to get it right on the beat. Maybe I slow the tempo down a little bit to make it a little bit easier. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 3. 1. Okay, well, I'm still off a little bit. By the way, yes, I'm messing this up on purpose because I want you to see how this works. There's a couple of options I have to get this to line up. One is I can drag the notes, and if I have them both selected and drag them, you notice they move the same amount. But if I just drag them individually, I can get them to line up on this grid really nicely. And when I press play on my clip, there we go. Now I've got a kick drum lined up perfectly on beats 1 and 3. Okay, that works. But that's a little bit tedious and not necessarily very musically satisfying, dragging things around. Sometimes you have to, but there's another way. I'm going to record this one more time. But this time, I'm going to go up to Edit first. I'm going to go down to record quantization. Quantization is a term that basically means you're going to force everything onto your piano roll's grid. Whatever you have the grid set up for, it's going to align with it. So I'm going to use eighth note quantization, which means every click of my click track and every evenly spaced moment right in between. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and I am going to get aligned on my piano roll. So eighth note quantization. Now check this out as I record it. And you actually saw it move it into the right spot for me. And now when I play it, I'm perfectly aligned and I'm ready to go. So I can quantize everything in place. Another option I have, I'm going to go quickly turn quantization off for just a moment. Oops, that was quarter note quantization, sorry. I'm going to turn it off. I'm going to record my snare part now. There's another option I can look at. So I'm going to try to get my snare drum to record on beats 2 and 4 right now. Here we go. Okay, so I'm close, but I'm not there. Now, I didn't have record quantization on, but I can do quantization after I've recorded as well. I have my snare selected. I'm leaving my kick drum as is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and right-click on one of those snare drum notes, and you'll notice it says Quantize Settings. Well, let's see. Do I want to move it to the eighth notes? Do I want to move to the quarter notes? Well, I want this on beats 1 and 3, so I'm going to choose quarter notes. I'm going to hit OK, and it moves it to the closest quarter note. And now when I play my clip, all right, I'm starting to get a beat here. Here we go. This is working. I'm going to go back in real quick to my edit menu, record quantization, eighth note quantize. I'm going to make sure that on my computer keyboard I have my hi-hat key reference. That's a tambourine. There's my hi-hat. I'm going to record my hi-hat. I'm just going to do eighth notes. There we go. They're all lined up nicely. I can add other things. I could add the tambourine in if I wanted. Oh, I added another hi-hat there. You can do all kinds of things. If I change my quantization to maybe say 16th notes, and I lay this back in, there's my hi-hat. I can do some other really fun things. I can keep adding to this. And all of a sudden, I've got a pretty cool beat going here. So the only other thing I probably want to do is now turn this metronome off because it's getting a little redundant. It's getting in the way of my beat. So there we go. I've got a beat in Ableton. It's lined up, it's consistent, it's steady. And that's pretty much this project. See what you can come up with. I cannot wait to hear your beats in class.